Prince Harry is not a particularly intelligent man, and according to this commentary, that may end up costing him millions of pounds once everything is settled in his legal case against the Daily Mail. The argument is that this case is about far more than Harry simply losing in court. It suggests that people allegedly took advantage of his lack of judgment to pursue their own agendas and then abandoned him and the other claimants when the case failed to produce the outcome they wanted. The commentator argues that this should concern King Charles and the monarchy because, in several cases this year, Harry's connection to the royal family has allegedly been used by people who are more strategic and influential than he is. According to this view, these individuals have used Harry's royal platform to promote their own causes, while Harry himself has failed to recognize that he is often being manipulated rather than genuinely supported. The video's host explains that while researching the Daily Mail case, a quote from royal commentator Victoria Arbiter stood out. Arbiter argued that since leaving the protection of the royal family, Harry has been surrounded by people looking to profit from him, including publishers, streaming services, lawyers, and campaigners, all presenting themselves as allies. However, once things went wrong, they allegedly moved on, leaving Harry to deal with the consequences alone. The commentator agrees with this assessment, but emphasizes that it does not excuse Harry's own actions, or many of the controversial statements he has made over the years. Instead, the comparison is made to Princess Diana's experience with the Martin Bashir interview, suggesting that just as Diana's vulnerabilities were exploited, Harry's paranoia, and, in the commentator's opinion, his limited judgment, have also been used by others for their own benefit. According to the commentary, Harry has long been viewed as someone who is not especially intellectually gifted. The speaker insists this is not intended as a personal insult, but rather as an observation that has frequently appeared in public discussion. Because of this, the commentator believes Harry struggles to recognize when people who are more experienced or more intelligent are using him to advance their own interests. While Meghan is mentioned as one example, the argument expands to include lawyers, campaign groups, and publications involved in the Daily Mail litigation. The commentary specifically points to organizations such as Byline Times and Hacked Off, arguing that they appear repeatedly throughout media coverage connected to the case. Although Hacked Off has reportedly denied direct involvement, the commentator questions whether these groups were truly uninvolved, noting that they have been associated with related reporting and campaigns. The suggestion is that these organizations benefited from Harry's involvement while distancing themselves once the case failed. The speaker argues that these behind-the-scenes influences have allegedly manipulated Harry to serve broader campaigns, particularly those aimed at challenging the monarchy and targeting the Daily Mail. According to the commentary, Harry's position as a rogue royal makes him a useful figure for these efforts, and the commentator predicts that this pattern could continue, especially if Harry faces increasing financial pressure in the future. The video then summarizes the background of the Daily Mail lawsuit. Harry and several co-claimants accused the newspaper of unlawful information gathering, including alleged phone hacking, obtaining phone records, bugging homes, and other illegal methods. Most of the allegations relate to events from the late 1990s and early 2000s, a media environment that was very different from today's digital landscape. The commentator notes that technology and journalism have changed significantly over the past 2 decades. Smartphones are far more secure than older mobile phones, and many of the practices being challenged no longer play the same role in modern reporting. Despite that, the speaker believes some campaigners remain deeply committed not only to exposing past misconduct within parts of the British media, but also to specifically damaging the Daily Mail. Turning to the court's decision, the commentator explains that Harry ultimately lost the case. According to the summary, Harry repeatedly argued that certain newspaper articles could only have been written if journalists had hacked his phone or accessed his personal records. However, during testimony, he acknowledged that friends and acquaintances also knew many of the details discussed in those stories. Because alternative sources of information existed, the judge reportedly concluded that Harry could not prove the information came from phone hacking rather than from people within his own circle. The burden of proof rested with the claimants, who were required to provide evidence supporting their allegations. According to the commentator, they failed to do so, leading the court to dismiss every claim. One example highlighted is a 2002 Daily Mail article discussing Harry's alleged flirtation with Natalie Pinkham, who was reportedly 6 years older than him at the time. The article described their interactions and attracted public attention. The commentator introduces this story as an example that will become important later in the discussion about the evidence presented in the case. The commentator explains that many royal watchers first became aware of Byline Times because of its coverage of the royal family. According to the speaker, the publication's first print edition strongly supported Prince Harry and Meghan while criticizing other royal figures and journalist Dan Wootton. The commentator argues that many of the publication's claims and insinuations ultimately failed to hold up and believes the outlet has consistently taken a pro-Harry and Meghan position. The speaker then points to what they consider a significant detail. Byline Times published a collection of 53 stories that it claimed involved phone hacking or the use of illegal private investigators by the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday. However, when Harry's lawsuit eventually reached court, 55 articles were presented as evidence. The commentator finds the similarity between those numbers noteworthy and suggests there may have been a connection between the publication's research and the material later used during the legal proceedings. The commentator says that while preparing an earlier video, they happened to use one example, the article titled Harry's Older Woman. Without realizing it also appeared among the stories highlighted by Byline Times. The article, originally published in 2002, focused on Harry's alleged flirtation with Natalie Pinkham. According to the speaker, this example illustrates what they believe was one of the biggest weaknesses in the overall case. Drawing on their academic background, the commentator explains that higher education often involves critically evaluating evidence by identifying both its strengths and its weaknesses. Applying that approach here, they argue that the evidence presented by Byline Times failed to establish a convincing link between the newspaper articles and illegal information gathering. The speaker quotes part of the original article, which attributed details about Harry's personal life to unnamed friends and stated that he had bombarded the woman with text messages and emails. According to the commentator, Byline Times argued that this type of language was consistent with information obtained through phone hacking because similar wording had appeared in previous privacy cases involving other newspapers. The commentator strongly disagrees with that reasoning. They argue that simply referring to unnamed friends or describing someone as sending many text messages does not prove that journalists hacked a phone. While acknowledging that some past cases involved reporters disguising illegally obtained information by attributing it to friends or sources, the speaker stresses that the same wording could also reflect legitimate information provided by actual friends. According to the commentator, both possibilities can exist at the same time. A story may originate from an illegal source, or it may come from someone who genuinely knew the information. Because of that, they argue that the burden rested on the claimants to prove that the information could only have been obtained through unlawful means. In their opinion, the claimants failed to meet that standard, which is why the Daily Mail case was ultimately dismissed. The speaker goes on to criticize Byline Times for publishing numerous articles that suggested reporting by journalists such as Katie Nicholl could only have been based on illegal information gathering. Although the commentator admits they have not reviewed every article in detail, they speculate that many of those stories likely became part of the court case and may even have influenced the legal strategy. The commentator concludes that similarities in language alone are not evidence of criminal conduct. They argue that using phrases such as friends said or bombarded with texts does not establish wrongdoing, even if similar wording appeared in previous legal cases. In their view, treating those similarities as proof of phone hacking is an unsound argument. Finally, the speaker returns to the numerical comparison, pointing again to the 53 stories highlighted by Byline Times and the 55 articles presented during the trial. The commentator finds the overlap notable and also observes that several of the same individuals appeared throughout both sets of material. What they find especially significant, however, is that despite publishing multiple articles accusing the Daily Mail of misconduct, Byline Times has, according to the commentator, remained largely silent after Harry's case failed, a silence the speaker believes is noteworthy. The commentator argues that the outcome of the Daily Mail court case seriously undermined the reporting that had been published by Byline Times. According to the speaker, the court's decision effectively rejected the central claims made throughout the publication's investigative series. The commentator also notes that, despite covering the issue extensively beforehand, the publication had offered little or no response after the case was dismissed, suggesting that its silence is significant. Returning to Prince Harry, the speaker argues that he was encouraged to pursue legal action by people who claimed they were supporting him but later distanced themselves once the case collapsed. In the commentator's view, the legal arguments were always weak because they relied on ordinary phrases such as references to friends or descriptions of someone being bombarded with text messages and emails without providing concrete evidence of illegal activity. The speaker argues that such expressions are common in journalism and cannot, by themselves, prove unlawful information gathering. The commentator suggests that Harry may have trusted organizations like Byline Times because they had published favorable coverage of him over the years. However, the speaker believes the publication either failed to conduct objective research or interpreted the evidence in a way that supported its preferred conclusion. According to the commentator, good research requires following the evidence wherever it leads, even if it disproves an original theory, rather than allowing personal opinions or agendas to shape the outcome. The speaker explains that everyone has personal biases, but argues that responsible analysis means trying to set those biases aside and letting the available evidence guide the conclusions. As an example, the commentator references another topic they have previously covered, saying they intentionally try to evaluate situations based on evidence rather than personal preference. The discussion then shifts to the organization Hacked Off, which campaigns for changes to press regulation. According to the commentator, the group advocates what it describes as greater accountability for the media, but the speaker believes those proposals would effectively amount to censorship. The commentator argues that Prince Harry and Meghan would naturally support such measures because they frequently object to negative media coverage. The speaker acknowledges that genuine media misconduct has occurred in the past, mentioning Hugh Grant's experience as an example of someone whose privacy was seriously violated. However, the commentator argues that isolated cases of wrongdoing do not justify broad restrictions on the press. In their view, a free media inevitably publishes stories that some people dislike, but it also plays an essential role in holding public figures accountable. Using their own YouTube channel as an example, the commentator explains that reading audience criticism has helped improve their content. The speaker argues that criticism, even when uncomfortable, can be valuable because it encourages people to reflect on their actions and improve. According to the commentary, public figures who seek to restrict criticism are often resisting accountability rather than addressing legitimate concerns. The commentator argues that the media serves an important function by correcting inaccurate public claims. As one example, the speaker refers to previous reporting that challenged statements made by Harry and Meghan about the timing of their marriage ceremony, arguing that such fact-checking demonstrates why an independent press remains necessary. In the commentator's opinion, if media organizations become too restricted, they will be unable to fulfill their role of informing the public and scrutinizing those in positions of influence. Turning back to Hacked Off, the speaker notes that the organization describes itself as campaigning for a free and accountable press. However, the commentator argues that such language can be misleading, believing that stronger regulation would ultimately reduce press freedom. Instead, the speaker suggests that public opinion should determine the credibility of media outlets rather than allowing a small group or regulatory body to decide what can and cannot be reported. The commentator also claims that Hacked Off has distanced itself from Harry's unsuccessful legal action after the case failed. According to the speaker, this follows the same pattern they see throughout the controversy. Harry was encouraged to pursue costly litigation, but was largely left to face the consequences alone once the court ruled against him. The speaker then quotes remarks from a board member of Hacked Off, who argued that the Daily Mail published articles containing private information without a clear public interest justification and suggested that some of the information could only have been obtained through unlawful methods. The commentator responds by emphasizing that these are opinions rather than established facts. According to the speaker, believing that illegal methods were used is not the same as proving they were used. The commentator argues that this distinction between belief and evidence was central to the court's decision. In their view, the judge required factual proof rather than assumptions about how journalists might have obtained information. Since the claimants failed to demonstrate that the articles could only have been produced through unlawful activity, the case was dismissed. The speaker concludes that Harry and the other claimants were encouraged to spend millions of pounds pursuing litigation that, in the commentator's opinion, was built on weak evidence and unrealistic expectations of success. Finally, the discussion turns briefly to the Leveson inquiry. The commentator notes that campaigners have long argued that politicians failed to fully implement the inquiry's recommendations on press regulation after canceling its planned second phase. The speaker adds that former Prime Minister David Cameron ultimately chose not to adopt the proposed framework, a decision that continues to be debated by supporters and critics of press reform. The commentator continues by discussing the political response to the Leveson inquiry. According to the speaker, former Prime Minister David Cameron decided not to introduce the additional legislation that some campaigners wanted because he believed stronger regulation of the press could restrict free speech. The commentator agrees with that decision, arguing that freedom of expression allows journalists, commentators, and content creators to express differing opinions without government interference. The speaker adds that while not everyone will agree with their work or with the work of others, that disagreement is part of a healthy system where audiences can decide for themselves whom they trust. The speaker argues that unethical media outlets generally lose credibility over time as inaccurate reporting is exposed. In the commentator's view, public scrutiny is a more effective form of accountability than government regulation. For that reason, the speaker believes stronger regulation of the press would inevitably lead to censorship rather than greater fairness. Returning to Hacked Off, the commentator quotes a statement suggesting that victims of intrusive reporting felt they had no choice but to bring civil cases against newspaper publishers. The speaker responds by arguing that many of those claimants ultimately lost their lawsuits and were left facing legal costs amounting to millions of pounds. According to the commentator, organizations supporting these legal efforts encouraged people to pursue cases that were unlikely to succeed because doing so aligned with their broader campaign for additional press regulation. The commentator also questions Hacked Off's public statement that it neither funded nor directly worked on the claims. Referring to previous reporting, the speaker expresses skepticism about that assertion and suggests the organization had closer involvement than it now acknowledges. The commentator argues that, after the unsuccessful outcome, campaign groups have attempted to distance themselves while praising the claimants for bringing the cases. The speaker objects to Hacked Off's description of the press as unregulated and unaccountable, arguing that the media is already subject to various forms of scrutiny, including public criticism and legal oversight. According to the commentator, no system is perfect, but allowing different viewpoints to compete freely is preferable to giving regulatory bodies greater control over what journalists may publish. Using examples from American politics, the speaker argues that both the political left and right have, at different times, sought to suppress information they considered unfavorable. The commentator then examines another statement from Hacked Off explaining that the court case required claimants to prove that specific newspaper articles had been produced through illegal methods. The speaker notes that there appears to be some inconsistency over whether the case involved 55, 56, or 57 articles, but argues that the exact number is less important than the legal standard applied by the court. According to the commentator, Hacked Off argued that the Daily Mail had paid private investigators more than £3 million over many years. However, the speaker responds that merely paying private investigators does not establish that every piece of information they obtained was acquired unlawfully. The commentator emphasizes that investigators may have gathered some information legally and some illegally, and that claimants therefore needed evidence directly linking specific articles to unlawful conduct. The speaker argues that this burden of proof was especially difficult because many of the allegations dated back more than 2 decades. With the passage of time, memories fade, documents disappear, and evidence becomes much harder to verify. According to the commentator, without a clear paper trail connecting a particular story to illegal methods, the court could not conclude that unlawful activity had occurred. The commentator agrees with the judge's reasoning that evidence of misconduct in some situations does not automatically prove misconduct in every article under dispute. In the speaker's view, each allegation had to be evaluated on its own evidence, and because the claimants could not provide sufficient proof for the specific stories they challenged, their claims were dismissed. Using an example from their own work, the commentator explains that journalists and researchers often need time to verify facts and locate supporting evidence before publishing information. The speaker argues that courts must operate according to the same principle, relying on documented evidence rather than assumptions, feelings, or personal beliefs. According to the commentary, justice depends on proving claims with facts rather than relying on speculation. The speaker then responds to Hacked Off's assertion that the Daily Mail had not been fully exonerated and that a second Leveson inquiry remains necessary. The commentator disagrees, arguing that the organization appears more interested in reviving the inquiry than in the outcome of the individual claimants' lawsuits. In the Speaker's opinion, the legal cases have become a means of advancing a broader campaign for stricter press regulation. Finally, the discussion turns to Hackett's view that newspapers should never publish private medical information, details about sexual orientation, or similar personal matters. The commentator argues that whether such information should be reported depends on the circumstances, particularly when it concerns individuals who hold public office or significant public influence. The Speaker also rejects the organization's criticism that newspapers regulate themselves, arguing that media organizations should remain independent rather than subject to stronger external controls. The commentator concludes by focusing on Hackett's criticism of newspapers publishing falsehoods, disinformation, or private information. According to the Speaker, determining what qualifies as falsehood or disinformation is often subjective and can itself become influenced by political or ideological bias. For that reason, the commentator believes granting authorities greater power to define acceptable reporting would create significant risks for freedom of expression. The Speaker argues that although the media sometimes makes mistakes, public criticism and open debate provide a safer means of correction than formal regulation, and concludes that this is one reason Harry and Meghan are portrayed as supporting organizations such as Hackett's. The commentator next examines Hackett's stated mission, which argues that Britain needs a stronger press that uses its resources to investigate corruption and hold powerful people accountable. The Speaker responds by questioning why that same level of scrutiny should not also be applied to organizations such as Hackett's itself. According to the commentator, campaign groups that encourage costly legal action should also be open to public criticism and examination. The Speaker disagrees with Hackett's view that independent and effective regulation is necessary to achieve a free and accountable press. In the commentator's opinion, genuine press freedom cannot exist alongside stronger regulatory controls because increased regulation inevitably limits what journalists are able to report. The Speaker argues that the concepts of a regulated and free press are fundamentally incompatible. The commentator then points to Hackett's published case studies, observing that they include material relating to Harry and Meghan, but not to Prince William and Catherine. The Speaker argues that the intense speculation surrounding Catherine's recovery from surgery and subsequent cancer diagnosis in 2024 also represented an example of intrusive media coverage. According to the commentator, many journalists failed to remind the public that the Princess of Wales had already announced she would be away from public duties for a period of recovery, allowing unnecessary speculation to grow. The Speaker argues that this omission demonstrates what they see as selective concern within Hackett's campaigns. In the commentator's opinion, intrusive reporting directed at William and Catherine deserves the same attention as similar reporting involving Harry and Meghan. Because that coverage is not highlighted in the organization's examples, the Speaker concludes that Hackett's displays a degree of bias. The discussion then returns to what the commentator describes as three different interests surrounding the Daily Mail case. The first is Byline Times, which the Speaker argues has consistently opposed the Daily Mail. The second is Hackett's, which the commentator believes seeks further press regulation through a second Leveson inquiry. The third, according to the Speaker, is lawyer David Sherburne, who represented the claimants in the litigation. The commentator refers to comments by journalist Nicole Lampert, who described one cross-examination during the trial as particularly unusual. According to Lampert, David Sherburne questioned her in a way that appeared to suggest she had somehow hacked police records to discover the cost of security at Elton John's wedding. The trial judge reportedly asked whether Sherburne was genuinely accusing her of hacking the police, after which, according to Lampert's account, the barrister moved on from the line of questioning. The Speaker highlights Lampert's description of Sherburne as an increasingly desperate barrister, arguing that a lawyer should not appear desperate during a case. In the commentator's view, this reflected the weakness of the legal arguments being presented. The Speaker also claims that the judge criticized attempts to broaden allegations beyond the claims originally brought before the court, emphasizing that accusations must remain within the scope of the evidence and the formal legal pleadings. Bringing these themes together, the commentator returns to Victoria Arbiter's earlier observation that Harry has been surrounded by people who profit from him after leaving the royal family. The Speaker agrees with that assessment and argues that Harry's poor judgment has made him especially vulnerable to manipulation by individuals and organizations pursuing their own objectives. The commentator also questions why Meghan allowed Harry to pursue litigation that, in the speaker's opinion, was unlikely to succeed. Speculating about possible motivations, the speaker suggests that the lawsuit has damaged Harry's public image and argues that a supportive spouse might have discouraged him from pursuing a case with such significant financial risks. These comments are presented as the commentator's personal opinion rather than established fact. To illustrate what the speaker considers a contrasting example, the discussion turns to William and Catherine. The commentator refers to previous reporting suggesting that Catherine has been an important influence in William's personal development, helping him manage his temperament, family life, and responsibilities after growing up in a less stable household following his parents' separation. According to the speaker, Catherine has provided guidance and support that has benefited William throughout their marriage. By contrast, the commentator argues that Meghan has not played a similarly supportive role in Harry's life. The speaker speculates that Meghan understood Harry's personality and perceived him as someone who was easily influenced. The commentator further claims that members of Harry's family, particularly Charles and William, repeatedly tried to warn him that he was making poor decisions and encouraged him to reconsider the direction he was taking. According to the speaker, William's primary concern was Harry's well-being rather than conflict with him. The commentator recalls accounts suggesting that William wanted Harry to be happy and believed many of his actions reflected growing anger and unhappiness. In the speaker's view, Harry's frustration, resentment, and emotional state made him increasingly susceptible to people who wished to use his royal status and public profile for their own political, financial, or personal objectives. The commentator concludes by arguing that Harry's legal battles, public disputes, and continued conflicts did not originate from a place of contentment, but from accumulated bitterness. According to the speaker, this emotional state, combined with what they see as Harry's poor judgment, made him vulnerable to manipulation by a variety of individuals and organizations, with Meghan described by the commentator as the most influential among them. The commentator argues that the pattern of Harry allegedly being influenced by others extends beyond the Daily Mail case. As examples, the speaker refers to Harry's public comments on international issues, including the Middle East and Ukraine, suggesting that he has been encouraged to support political positions without fully understanding the broader context. According to the commentator, people around Harry are using his public profile to advance their own agendas because they believe his royal status gives their messages greater visibility. These claims are presented as the speaker's personal opinion and interpretation. The discussion also mentions an article published under Harry's name in the New Statesman concerning relations between Jewish and Muslim communities in the United Kingdom. The commentator expresses the opinion that Harry was unlikely to have written or fully developed the article himself, suggesting instead that members of his team may have used his platform to promote ideas they supported. The speaker argues that this is another example of Harry being influenced by advisors whom they believe are more politically experienced than he is. Looking back over the year, the commentator claims there have been several occasions in which Harry's public standing has been used to promote the objectives of governments, political groups, media organizations, or campaigners. According to the speaker, this pattern raises concerns not only for Harry personally, but also for the future reputation of the British monarchy. The commentator then turns to reports that King Charles still hopes to meet Harry, Meghan, and his grandchildren. The speaker believes there are both personal and constitutional reasons for this. On a personal level, the commentator suggests that Charles, who is undergoing cancer treatment, naturally wishes to spend time with his grandchildren. The speaker says that desire is understandable from a human perspective. However, the commentator also speculates that Charles may be considering the long-term constitutional implications of Harry's recent actions. According to the speaker, Harry's public criticism of the court's ruling in the Daily Mail case, including his suggestion that the judgment was effectively a whitewash, could be interpreted as a rejection of the British legal system. The commentator believes this may lead Charles to consider whether changes should eventually be made to Harry's official royal status, although this is presented entirely as speculation rather than established fact. The speaker further suggests that if Charles were ever to support measures affecting Harry's titles, place in the line of succession, or other royal positions, Harry might permanently cut off contact with him. Because of that possibility, the commentator argues that Charles may feel it is important to maintain a relationship with Harry and his grandchildren while the opportunity still exists. According to the commentator, Harry's recent actions demonstrate how easily influential people can allegedly persuade him to support causes that serve their own interests. The speaker argues that this vulnerability could become even greater if Harry experiences increasing financial pressure, particularly after the significant legal costs associated with his unsuccessful court case. In the commentator's opinion, this combination of financial strain and poor judgment makes Harry especially susceptible to outside influence. The speaker concludes that King Charles may eventually have to take difficult decisions to protect the institution of the monarchy, while also making clear to Harry that he remains loved as a son. According to the commentator, Harry's own choices have created a situation that has become increasingly difficult for the royal family to manage. I end the final section. The commentator draws a comparison between Harry's current situation and the experience of his mother, Diana, Princess of Wales. The speaker refers to the widely documented findings that journalist Martin Bashir used deception to secure Diana's 1995 Panorama interview, arguing that her growing paranoia was manipulated during that period. The commentator notes that Diana later declined official police protection and, on the night of her fatal car crash in Paris, was not wearing a seatbelt. These historical facts are presented alongside the speaker's opinion that manipulation played a significant role in Diana's decisions. According to the commentator, Harry is now following what they see as a similar pattern by becoming increasingly suspicious of those around him, while placing trust in people who may not have his best interests at heart. The speaker argues that Harry's own decisions have left him vulnerable to individuals who seek to benefit from his royal status and public profile. The video concludes with the commentator expressing the view that, unless meaningful action is taken, Harry's situation is likely to deteriorate further. The speaker believes that protecting the long-term interests of the British monarchy will require difficult decisions from King Charles in the future. The commentator then thanks viewers for watching, says they hope the investigation was informative, and promises to return with another video soon.